Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much for inviting me here. As we're congregated here in the Aberystwyth Arts Centre with its tremendous view of Cardigan Bay, I'd like to start by considering what our location may look like if looked at from the sea. That is the perspective that Richard Collins, who we'll be hearing from in a short film later, took in his Whitbread-nominated novel, The Land as Viewed from the Sea. And in many ways, his book is the reason for this project. And as Mike kindly outlined, this broader project is a WISERD-funded project on page and place, ongoing compositions of plot. The book's currently with the publisher, so in about 3 months' time, it'll be on the shelves. So as a geographer, I've always been curious about the relationships between people and place. How people are defined to some extent by the places around them, and how places become inveigled and intertwine with our identities, our memories, and our lives. The Land as Viewed from the Sea, along with Collins's other novels, Overland and The Quality of Light, explore these themes. So when I first read The Land as Viewed from the Sea, I didn't pay attention to the biography of its author, and thus know any details about where it might be set. Nevertheless, I was intrigued by the fact that no actual place names were mentioned in the text. Furthermore, I was inspired by the book's title and cover, and I'm guessing you can't see that from here, but effectively it's a view of the open ocean. But if we turn to the back cover, we see a little bit of land and a hint of where that might be, and those of us who might know South Wales, the area around Porthcawl, we might recognise that coastline. So the cover photo reminded me of the land as viewed from the sea around Aberystwyth, initially from the front, but also Porthcawl when we look from the back. And coupled to the idiosyncratic perspective captured by the book's title, the landscapes described in the book were for me so obviously from Wales, and particularly from Ceredigion. In Lopez's words, they connected human enterprise to a real and specific place. In later conversation with Richard, I told him about how, for me, his novels were strongly connected to this geography. And he replied, yes, they are connected to these spaces. It's because I'm interested in places as much as I'm interested in people. I'm not happy with novels that don't have a description of place. They don't have a setting. If two characters are walking down a track in the first page of a novel, I want to know if the sun is shining, or whether it's raining. What season is it? I want to know the sense of place. Without that, I put it down and pick up something else. And even the vocabulary there for human geographies would resonate with some authors that we're familiar with. So this response gave me further evidence to suggest that for Richard Collins, like so many novelists, perhaps particularly in Wales, and perhaps for many of us in general, we all are, to an extent, secret geographers. That he and we have entangled relationships between page and place. And this is very much articulated by two characters in The Land as Viewed from the Sea through this conversation. How's the novel? Well, it's going well, actually too well. How's that? It's getting itself mixed up with reality. I drink my tea and muse on the power of fiction. There's no escaping it. So this talk focuses on the relations between stories and place. From a disciplinary perspective, it connects the worlds of human geography and literature. From a geographer's perspective, humans are spatial beings. Who we are, what we do, and how we conceive of ourselves is influenced to a large extent by where we are. Geography plays a key role in defining us, as Soja confirms. Geography is vital to our human identity. So if people are geographical beings, what can fiction tell us about this truth? This presentation and the book on which it's based explores how literature can help us understand the nature of the relations between people and place, how humans create connections between their identities and their geographies, and how these can be threatened or lost. Literature is an important, if unusual, way to explore these relations. At once centred in imagination and ideas, fiction is also indelibly connected to, as well as influenced by, the geographies in which it's set. As I will outline, the relationship between fiction and location is so important that it's often difficult to know which is imagined and which is real. Through exploring the relations between people and place through fiction writing set in and around Aberystwyth, this talk garners poetic insight into how places are written into our stories, and how these stories take and make the places around us in order to help understand the role that places play in defining human identity. So what I'm going to do in the next half hour or so is briefly introduce the conceptual context to the relationships between literature and geography, and introduce a notion that's elaborated more in the book, the notion of plot. Then I'm going to talk about some of the writers used in this project to explore these ideas, including Niall Griffiths, Malcolm Price and Richard Collins. Then I'm going to introduce a film by Richard, it's about 15 minutes long, after those sections, and then make some concluding remarks and open up for any discussion. So the fields of literature and geography have many elements in common. As Pocock tells us, both disciplines are connected to the integrated triad of person, narrative and place, whilst both also seek to use these constitutive relations to offer new insights into the human condition. So just as humans are spatial beings, fictional writing is inherently geographical in nature. As all authors are aware, fictional worlds are constituted by three key components: characters, timeline and geographical context. Of these key constituents, geography perhaps is crucial. As Piatti observes, it is impossible to think of literature without any spatial context. Geography is therefore essential to fiction. However, the relationship between real places and literary stories is a complex one. In some cases, fiction intersects directly with real-world cartographies. In other fictions, real geographies are reworked, with distances reduced, streets folded together, and landmarks scrumpled. In this way, brave new worlds perhaps are invented in the author's imagination and in ours. So the scholarly investigation of the relationships between geography and fiction often asks questions such as, where is fiction set, or where are stories located? And although these are vital to the meaning and significance of any narrative, they often underplay the significance of geography in fiction. In a similar way to a scientific framing of place, this perspective reduces the world around us to a passive stage on which characters might make their entrances and their exits. Such framing makes it easy to keep the physically comprehensible world apart from the literary world, effectively constructing an impassable boundary that separates the real on one hand from the imagined on the other. However, I argue this straightforward border between the real and the imagined in the geography of fiction is far from impregnable. In many ways, there are close and confusing connections between the real and the fictional. So whilst it may be tempting to keep apart the literary and the literal, it's increasingly common to unpick the deep-rooted complexities embedded within the literary representations of space and place. As Anne Howard Saunders, another ex-Aberystwyth student, remarks, geography pervades and penetrates creative writing, whilst creative writing, I would also add, pervades geographies. As a consequence, it makes little sense to erect a border between the worlds of fiction and reality, rather acknowledge the existence of a permeable membrane, as Piatti observes, between these worlds that can be crossed at will. And if we activate the previously passive relationships between literature and geography in this way, we become sensitive to the agency and influence that literature has on geography and vice versa. We can no longer maintain a rigid separation between the literary and the literal, but rather need to examine how this permeable membrane between them is crossed and contaminated. As I've argued in the book, we can use the spatial metaphor of entanglements to conceptualise these crossings between text and territory, suggesting how story and location are always implicated in and constitutive of one another, as Sharp et al. Sum up. The use of the term entanglement suggests an image of knotted threads, and it's intended to underline the deep spatiality of this spinning together of, in this case, text and territory. I can talk about entanglements to indicate that text and territory are always played out in and across each other. So framing the literary and the literal as entangled phenomena suggests, therefore, that page and place cannot exist independently of each other. I argue that the literary relies on the literal for a grounded materiality, whilst the literal relies on the imagined for an alternative reality, for an escape, for a utopia, or perhaps even a dystopia. In short, there is no separation between page and place. From this entangled perspective, it makes more sense to suggest that we're not dealing here with page and place, but page in place and place in page. Borrowing language from a geographical tradition, there is a constitutive co-ingredience of text and territory, as Ed Casey would put it. The text and the territory are always connected. Storylines can take you to an actual place, whilst a real connection is constantly shadowed by our literary imaginations and emotion. So the book of which this talk is a part focuses on 11 authors of the geographies of fiction in Wales. From Peter Finch, Lloyd Robson, Tessa Hadley, and Andrew Craig Williams' short stories in Cardiff. And here I just want to draw your attention to a website that was live as of yesterday, so literally hot off the press. And given my ability with the remote, we'll see whether this interconnection works, but hold on a moment. Confusion is that what I see down here is not what you see out there. But here we have the Cardiff Plotlines website, and it's based on the authors that are from the broader monograph, but just for the area of Cardiff. And you can go through the Cardiff Orders section to stalk the city with Peter Finch, or walk around a map of the city through the stories of Angie Williams, similarly through the more suburban area of Roath and through her story, The London Train, and then the short stories and poems of Lloyd Robson around the more edgy territories of Splot and Adamstown in the kind of twilight zone, that conventional twilight zone of the city. So, not only do we have a Cardiff base for this book, but also we deal with issues of nation, based on the novel Everything Must Change by Graham Davis and the poetry and the prose of Gillian Clarke. And we look at the borderland area and the issues of identities. We cross between the Welsh and English border through the work of Owen Shears, through his passion play and through his book Resistance, as well as his poems, and the novel Landor's Tower by the renowned psychogeographer Ian Sinclair, perhaps more famous for his work in London, but his roots in Cardiff and South Wales are still strong. And then, of course, in the second section of the book, we have a section that's entitled Kaleidoscopic Aberystwyth, looking at the work of local authors, Niall Griffiths, Malcolm Price, and Richard Collins, of which I'd like to give you a short taster in the next section of this talk. So, spun like a centrifuge from the urban conurbations of London, Cardiff and Liverpool, the characters in Niall Griffiths' novel whirl, drift and disturb the remote, isolated and difficult to reach town of Aberystwyth. According to Griffiths, in his contribution to Peter Finch's Real series, Aberystwyth is a place at the end of somewhere, a terminus. This is a town at the end of the line, folded in tightly between the mountains and the sea, a place that is, to quote Fowler in Griffiths' Real Aberystwyth, a place that is equally inconvenient to everyone. Despite this uncompromising location, Aberystwyth remains a magnet for many seeking an escape from modern life. As Griffiths outlines, there's a strange draw to the place. Get off the train and you can't go any further. Stand on the promenade and the next landmass is Ireland, and after that, America. Mountains pile up behind you and you feel you can't go back into their bulwark mass, but the sea there in front of you is a blue world of possibility. And between that and the giant rocks is this small, intriguing town. For those who have been attracted here, Aberystwyth's location becomes part of its charm. As a resident for 3 years in the early 2000s, I was glad to brave the inconvenience of geography, not only today, but when I came up to interview Niall Griffiths, to relive the town and its hinterland through Griffiths' novels. To meet Niall, I drove into Ceredigion on a grey spring day, with the hills covered, and I quote from Griffiths here, in that thin rain that just gets you drenched. As I switch on my windscreen wipers and see the damp slate roofs and rocky outcrops around the town, I am reminded how Aberystwyth offers a blank Paleozoic geology from which individuals can assemble a life. As Griffith puts it, Aberystwyth is what you make it. It supplies the materials, and what you build with them is entirely up to you. There are many real Aberystwyths, as there are inhabitants of this peculiar, fascinating town. Look at the light with which the scene is lit. The bleached spill from the takeaways, and the lilac lightning of the meat wagons, and the ochre sodium of the streetlights, and the pulsing rainbows from the clubs and the bars. It's Onieric. It's fantastic. The town seems to lend itself to endless reinvention. And through the lens of Niall Griffiths' entanglement between page and place, Aberystwyth offers a destination for drifters, a draw for individuals who have nowhere else to go and no Hiraeth to call home. These drifters not only bring wildness to Aberystwyth streets, but also find in the wilderness of its hills a new form of belonging to that of modern life. In Grits and Sheepshagger, Griffiths offers us a view on how these new forms of meaning and connection can mobilise primal passions, mustering defence and loyalty, not to an imagined nation, or indeed modern notions of celebrity culture, but to a relation with the natural world that is pre-modern and perhaps even pre-literate in nature. With the hope of the sea in front of them and the immensities of the mountains behind, his characters become sensitive to the beauty and value of nature as a contrast to the grime and shallowness of modern culture. In line with Edmund Burke's description of the sublime from way back in 1761, his characters come to appreciate the world of nature. It is in the natural landscape that they find their meaning and their sense of beauty, as Griffiths' character Colm notes. I walked into town along the prom. Gulls and pigeons were perched on the railings, but they all squawked off when I coughed up another load of phlegm. Ugh, the cold's going like, but the guitar is still doggedly hanging on. I spat a big bundle of green slimy stuff over the railings into the sea. The sea looked incredible. I looked down the coast ahead of me. The last straggling streetlights in Aberystwyth and Newquay are just about discernible through the swirls of mist, miles away like, shining weakly out from an ungraspably huge line of towering mountains and cliffs. It looks beautiful, and if I had any breath left in me after last night's debaucheries, then it would be taken away by the view. The world can be gorgeous sometimes. Griffiths' Aberystwyth does not shine a light on a town that is clear-cut, middle-class and university-oriented, like the version perhaps presented by Collins, as we'll see later on. As Griffiths recounted in conversation, his Aberystwyth is not the one everyone from this middle-class incarnation of the town recognises. And I quote, "People would say to me, 'This isn't the Wales I know.' You know, that kind of thing. People have their own aspects and own experiences. And even the mayor of Aber, he said, 'This town isn't the grit, is it? This isn't the Aber I know.' And I said, 'No, but it's the Aberystwyth I know. There's many different towns in this place.'" And another version of Aberystwyth, this town that's there for countless reinvention, is the Aberystwyth of Malcolm Price. So across the 6 books that recount the travails of private detective Louis Knight, Malcolm Price's Aberystwyth is perhaps another town most people don't know, the quintessential place of mind stuff, and I take that phrase from Richard Collins. And in that, he's referring to this idea that our mind stuff is half imagination and half reality. And over its series, Price has conjured a parallel universe for the town, populated by sadistic games teachers, druidic cleaners, femme fatales in stovepipe hats, and a good-hearted gumshoe who seeks to, and I quote from Don't Cry for Me, Aberystwyth, seeks to bring justice to birth. And he does so in this bizarre refraction and convincingly surreal version of a mid-Walian seaside town, as one reviewer put it. And this is how Price puts it. Once, you got a free bed and board in Aberystwyth if you bought a return ticket at Euston. Nowadays, they don't even cut the grass between the tracks. "You know what it is, don't you?" said Eeyore. "It's like that movie with Charlton Heston about the apes. You know, the scene at the end when he rides that horse along the beach and sees the torch of the Statue of Liberty projecting out of the sand. Suddenly he realises he's been on planet Earth all along, after it's been taken over by apes. And that's Aberystwyth. Perhaps this entanglement of different ideas and thoughts that we can't ever detach anymore from our vision of the place." So in his Aberystwyth Monomore series, Price has created a universe of characters, locations, atmospheres and philosophies that entangle with the real locations of Wales. Like laying a cloth over a table, Price layers fictional mythologies over the town, creating, and I quote from Piatti and Herney here, "a rich geographical layer hovering, so to speak, above the physically comprehensible world." In a similar way to the reconstitution of the town following a biblical-style flood in Aberystwyth Monomore, where the dams of the nearby Nantymock Reservoir were breached by a World War II bomber, Price has rebuilt the town as a hybrid of Raymond Chandler detective fiction, noir films and black comedy. Price has, in this way, storied Aberystwyth afresh. In doing so, he's added literary stories, in the other sense of the term, in terms of like multi-storey car parks, to its geography. He has contributed Moulin clubs, ice cream stalls and seaside donkeys to the layers of entanglement that now define the town. These extra stories, in both senses of the term, are based on an identification of and basis in the real Aberystwyth. As Price states, "A lot of people write to me to say that they feel I have captured a distinctly recognisable essence of the town, one that they recognise." Yet he goes on, "But it's only semi-real, isn't it? As various people have pointed out, my version is a parallel universe version of Aberystwyth, which is superimposed on the real one. The two versions are not exactly congruent. My Aber incorporates recognisable aspects of the real world, such as, for example, the prom, the castle and the pier. Other parts are pure invention. So Price's version of Aberystwyth plays with very British notions of the seaside town. Ice creams and kiss-me-quick hats still exist in many coastal resorts, but they do so perhaps as memento moris for bygone eras of holiday innocence, saucy postcards and amusement arcades. Into this heady mix of reminiscence, Price adds the faded grandeur that is not uncommon in a Victorian seaside town, and the remoteness of Aberystwyth itself not only gives the town an end-of-the-pier curiosity, but also an end-of-the-line rarity. There aren't many places like Aberystwyth anymore. This recollection of resorts past is further intertwined with a sense that modern life, even the modern life of Aberystwyth, which perhaps is not always that up-to-date, has lost something in this inevitable treadmill to progress. So this recollection of resorts past and a loss of innocent present adds a pervading sense of nostalgia and hereith for this version of the town. The reader is invited to relive their own entangled imaginings of holidays gone by and childhoods lived and lost. This Aber is a place without sat-navs, without Wi-Fi, even without public telephones. Price plays with these ideas of childhood and simpler lives with the omnipotence of Louis Knight's old-school teachers, looming large as threats to our detective hero, as he writes in Last Tango to Aberystwyth. I took the Lambaran road out towards the mountains of Plinlimmon, along the course of the Rydal for a while, and then cut south at Pontyfyd on the A4120 towards Ysbyty Cynfyn. A sign told me I was taking the Pont Ysbyty Cynfyn over the Nant Ysbyty Cynfyn, and that was reassuring to know. Before too long, if my car didn't give out, I would be heading towards Ysbyty Ystwyth. The world was full of Ysbytys today, and I wondered what it meant. Not knowing the answer in Love Spoon's classes would have resulted in a board rubber exploding next to one's ear like flak. Ysbyty Ystwyth. The map gave it a black cross for a place of worship and a black box underneath, meaning one with a tower rather than a spire, a minaret or a dome. It also had a little symbol to say there was a public telephone. Compared to Ysbyty Cynfyn, which had none of these, it was Las Vegas. So perhaps the remoteness of Aberystwyth transposes a freedom to the fiction writer, which is perhaps enhanced by the oneiric quality of the air, which facilitates the imagination. Aberystwyth does tend to invite flights of fancy. I asked Malcolm Price if there is something about being at the end of the line that encourages or even necessitates such flights of fancy. Quite possibly, he says. Part of the town's character has to do with the journey you have to undertake to get there, which I guess some of us have done within the last hour or so. The train journey is epic. But if you arrive by car over Pengais Hill, the view of the town, the view as the town rises into view is quite astonishing. Like coming upon the lost valley of some fabled warrior race. It's impossible not to feel a little skip in the heart when you see that view. It's all down there from there, of course. Just kidding. And as I'm just reading that out, I'm getting that wave of shivers down in spine when I was living here and drove over the top of Pengais Hill and you see the sea out in front of you. The world is a beautiful place. And I'd add in the epithet that Colin's character did before if I was minded to, but it gives you that feeling every time you see it, as Price writes in Last Tango. We reached the crest of Pengais Hill and suddenly, as it always did, that familiar sight of Aberystwyth appeared in the valley below like a faithful dog, making the heart glad. Skeins of smoke drifting across the slate roofs, the battered old pier and the pointy turrets of the old college, all set against the backdrop of a dove-grey sea. So Richard Collins's novel, The Land is Viewed from that Sea, is another example of an author inventively playing with the relations of page and place. As reviewer and acclaimed short story writer Ali Smith explains, The Land as Viewed from the Sea is centred around the premise that a man is writing a novel and showing it as he does so to his friend on whose farm he is working. The novel is about a man out at sea on a boat, considering a past love affair. None of this is real, the writer insists to his friend. But it doesn't take long for the real to affect the fictive, and for the friends to become caught up, not just in the composition and its sources, but also the unsayable things in their lives. So the land as viewed from the sea juxtaposes three constituent elements: the sea, the land, and the shore. As Collins describes, perhaps all at sea is a man on a sailboat who is looking back at the shore and reminiscing on a relationship. On the land itself, the two friends, Julian and the narrator John, labour on a farm. As the seasons change, John writes his novel based on his reminiscences of a love affair and shares his writings with Julian. The shore is the location for the third element in the novel, the site of that love affair. As Collins states, the two lovers are located at the meeting point of the land and sea all the time. You can hear the waves breaking in the background. It just worked really well. They're on that literal edge. For the couple, the shoreline becomes the place where, and I quote, their souls are at the centre of an elemental tug of war. Their tempestuous, chaotic affair are changing John's life as he succumbed to, and I quote again from Collins, a powerlessness, an escape from reality, whatever that is, an escape from an insanity and a loss of control. So as we've seen at the start of this talk, place is fundamental to the fiction of Richard Collins. In his words, I wouldn't dream of starting a novel without knowing exactly where it was located. It's absolutely essential. It's part of the imagery, it's part of the plot, it's part of the tone of it, and because the characters and interaction with their environment is part of their every move, it's part of the characterisation as well. Despite places being crucial to Collins's plot, the author chooses not to name the places in which he sets his fiction. And to evoke a place, but not explicitly locate it, has a curious effect on the reader. In the absence of place names, descriptions of locations act as teasers, suggesting to the reader that these sites may be wholly imaginary, but also may have a real-world counterpart somewhere. It's as if the author is inviting the reader into a secret, semi-fictional world, one that may coexist with the real one, but where that counterpart lies, known only to the author. Despite this, a reader is teased into solving that mystery. Whilst reading, it is possible for the reader to decipher clues about the novel's real geography by recognising landmarks or recalling locations outlined in the fiction. The entanglement of page and place thus has the effect of seducing the reader, inviting them onto the page and imagining the fictional world for themselves. It's as if the author has sketched the outline of a real place, and the reader is asked to colour it in, add dimension to it, and do so with their own memories and imaginations. As with many themes in Collins's novel, this idea is echoed in the thoughts of the characters in his story, in this case in a conversation between the lovers John and Catherine. Then they turn towards the sea. You know the way the bay curves round here, she says. It's like a big amphitheatre. All the way around there are people looking in, from the beaches and the cliff tops. But there's an empty stage, he says. There's nothing out there. But isn't that why we like it, she says. We can people it with our own imaginings. And given the different nature of the audience we might have here, some people are native, shall we say, indigenous to Aberystwyth, and some are visiting it. I'm going to kind of give you a test now. I'm going to give you a couple of different quotations from The Land as Viewed from the Sea, and perhaps you can people it with your own imaginations. This might echo resonances in your own lives. You might recognise these views, but you might recognise them on a very generic level, or come to see them in the next few days as you're here in the town. Or you might think, I know these really well, and I've played out aspects of my life in those places. And as you do so, you inveigle your own lives into this fiction. So where are these places? He's been tacking close into the wind and heading out into the bay. Now he turns the boat. The wind fills the other side of the sails, and he runs in towards and along the coast, the wind on the starboard beam now, the boat keeling over to port. Closer to the shore, he can gradually see more of the largest town in the bay. Like most seaside towns, it looks better, viewed from the sea. You can't see the railway sidings or the gasworks, but instead the long terraces of fine Victorian houses on the front, and above them large handsome buildings looking out over the sea. The library, the university, near to the top of the hill, the hospital. And secondly, Sean and Catherine are at a small station waiting for his train. The single platform faces away from the village and the sea, and so they find themselves looking inland across the tracks to the marshes and the bleak hills beyond. They are the only people there. Busy today, he says. She looks at him inquiringly. 3 crows, he says. Oh, and the 2 sheep in the field over there. I don't know what your brother is going to make of this place. Straight from the city to the edge of the known world. A bit of a culture shock. So for this reader, it's intriguing to feel the power of this novel may come in part from a reader's ability to unpick the entanglements of Collins' semi-secret plot. I discussed with Richard my thoughts on the mystery of location in his novels, and it transpires it's an issue he has considered deeply. I like to call it, he says, and I made this up, controlled ambiguity, leaving the reader some work to do and leaving them space to project their own stuff, and perhaps by this he means their own mind stuff, that half reality and half imagination, onto his plot. It shouldn't be a mess, but it should be ambiguous. There's something too literal about solid place names, and writers before me like Hardy and Lawrence have made up names, but it gives a more dreamlike quality to the writing to not include them at all. This was really important for the book, as it's about that kind of illusory quality of passionate love. It has to be dreamlike to work on that level. I think someone said in a review it was lifelike and dreamlike at the same time. I was delighted, as that's what I was aiming for. So the absence of place names is a crucial part of that. So the effectiveness of controlled ambiguity throws light on the important relationship between author and audience, and the power of language to represent and perform the plot. As Nigel Thrift tells us, language functions as a communication device that is both representative, i.e. standing in for things, practices and actions, as well as being performative, conveying more holistic aspects of emotions and empathy. Through these functions, language sets up the intersubjective space of common action, as Thrift has put it. This intersubjective space makes it possible for an author and their audience to communicate and connect with one another. However, there is always an ambiguity, as Richard has outlined, in this intersubjective space of common action, and it's this ambiguity that Collins seeks to exploit. Language can never fully capture or wholly represent the real world of experience, and it can never wholly communicate emotions and effect. Life overspills language, and words remain an imprecise tool to capture its complexity. It's inevitable, therefore, that in this space between the author and the reader there will be both clarity and ambiguity. If exploited correctly, this ambiguity can leave space for the reader to step into the text and populate it with their own encounters and experiences, creating a plot that is not simply the product of the author anymore, but is also created in part by the imagination and experiences of the reader. The pages and places formed through these spaces are now essentially collaborative, forged through the meeting of author and audience. It's through this interpenetration of experiences, representations and interpretations that we come to know these plots. This is precisely the process that occurred for me, at least, in The Land as Viewed from the Sea. Imagining the text was set in the geographies of Borth and Aberystwyth, as we saw from those 2 clips, if anyone was in any doubt. But while I was never wholly certain of this fact when I was reading it, I was able to fill in the gaps between Collins's words with my own experiences and imaginations of these places. Due to the geographical nature of the human condition, not only did I feel as if these places were part of my life, but reading these places in a fiction also interpenetrated my life into those stories, and those stories back into my life. Through using controlled ambiguity, Collins, perhaps unwittingly, had indelibly connected his fiction into my version of Ceredigion. So as we've seen how Collins' narratives invite the reader to bring their own imaginations to the plot. Through controlled ambiguity and harnessing the power of mind stuff, Richard Collins has been able to capture that oneiric quality of the land and the sea around the hinterland of Aberystwyth. As Collins writes, despite his unwillingness to formally map his stories. My writing is rooted in this place. This place does matter. My writing's rooted in this place, of course it is. It's not a book about Wales in a political or a social sense, but it is about landscape. I originally thought of it as a British landscape, the west of Britain, but people have read this book and recognised this very valley, so I have to admit it's more rooted in this specific place than even I imagined it was. So as a consequence of rooting his writing in this way, in a similar way to Walt Whitman, Collins is able to invite the soul of the reader to imagine and reminisce about how the past affects the present, about how we are formed by our past relationships. I mused on the knowledge that my version of The Land as Viewed from the Sea is a very personal one, and may not be shared by others. My reality, itself composed by an individual entanglement of place, page and personal memory, is simply one in a plurality that are they themselves constituted by an amalgam of ontological facts, controlled ambiguity, unreliable memory and poetic imagination. No author or reader knows what the experience of a novel or place is like for another. And the role that mind stuff plays in isolating individuals reminds me of Daniel, a character in Collins's novel Overland, which is the second novel in his series, I suppose. So Daniel, a character in this novel, it reminds him of the importance of being able to find someone, and I quote, who shares his universe. With this in mind, in the third novel, The Quality of Light, that Richard made mention of there, Isabel suggests the best thing one can hope for is to, and I quote, see someone else's view of that mountain. In Collins's novels as a whole, then, the conclusion to me is clear, that this entangled mix of page and place, this mix of mind stuff, memory and imagination, is deemed the only thing that's really important. It far outweighs the importance of what is factually or ontologically true. The emotional resonance of the connections between page and place mean that the liberations over controlled ambiguity, or the intersubjective spaces of common action, these are far from abstract retreats into theory or philosophical detachment, but rather are an affirmation of the importance of imagination and revisioning to our sense of belonging. From the evidence of Collins's plots, in order to be fully human requires memory myths, more than the need for a cold, hard vision of factual reality. And in order to sum this up and bring us towards our conclusion, I want to read an extended extract from The Land as Viewed from the Sea, between the two lovers that Julian and John are writing and conversing about. So getting towards evening, the air still and the sun half obscured by a thin cloud. The sea appears to have its own light coming from below or within, and glows with a metallic sheen. It looks otherworldly to me, he says. I don't think you can take a picture of that, can you? There's a long pause, during which her face, the face of the artist who's trying to paint that picture, clouds over with a frown. I hate it when you don't understand my art, she says. It's the most important thing to me. Perhaps I do understand a little, he responds. But because you take such care to get certain images, I think you're trying to capture the real scene. And then you take the photographs and work on them and distort them with a computer, or wrap them up in a painting until there's nothing much left of that original. So I wonder why you took such care in the first place. Or you produce a series that tells a story that never actually happened, that wasn't actually true. Or you paint something that seems unrelated to what you actually started out with, what's actually out there. She watches him very carefully as he speaks. Then I realise what you're doing, he says. That you capture a feeling, a sense of what was there for you. And I understand that that is more realistic in a way than any apparently accurate picture. I mean, that's all we have really, our perceptions, our feelings. She is radiant, smiling as if he's making love to her. I think you really do understand a little, you wonderful man. Her eyes light up and she looks childishly happy. There is a strange deep curve to her lower lip as she smiles. Let's have some food and then a serious drink, she says. But before we go there, I'll just wrap it up with a conclusion. So by looking to literature to understand the relations between people and place, we see how location and identity are formed through a complex entanglement of ideas and practices. We are geographical beings, and the places around us influence our sense of well-being, our sense of identity, and ultimately our belonging. Through these connections with people, stories and practices, places form the stage and an active presence in our everyday, storing our memories and storying our lives. The geographies of fiction offer a vital insight into this state of ongoing composition. To paraphrase the author Carol Williams, fiction can expose us to some of the connections and contradictions that are meaningful to our position, be that in Aberystwyth or wherever we live our lives. So literary geographies, therefore, are a key source that can help to define ourselves, our communities, and the places in which we live. And it's been my pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about some of my ideas around them with you tonight.